Look at that beard, it's getting bigger again. It's returning to its old grandness. What up, you fluffy bastards? My name is Liquid Blitz, and today I'm bringing to you my guide to improving your aim. I'm talking across the board, hipfire accuracy, aimed accuracy, all accuracy, even in vehicles and planes. It's all sort of wrapped up in one big theme, so let's get right into it. Now, I've watched other videos on accuracy by much bigger YouTubers than I, but I honestly thought they were sort of either too general in some aspects, or they didn't really emphasize the importance of some aspects over others. And I swear to God, at least half of their advice is so sort of obvious and general that it isn't really advice, it's something you do anyway. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to do like a mix of looking at other YouTubers' advice and sort of correct it in my own sort of style, in my own way. Basically giving you my opinions about it. A mix of that, and I'll just give you some of my own advice straight from my head. The first, to be honest, nearly useless piece of advice I've heard is to learn where the centre of your screen is. I've heard more than one YouTuber talk about this, and it's supposedly to help you when you're hip firing and when you first react and aim down sight and start shooting. Now, while to some degree this is valid, you don't need to be told that. It's the sort of thing you pick up just by playing for a while. And when you aren't playing hardcore, you have a crosshair at all times anyway. And when you're sprinting, you actually have a pinpoint accurate little upwards arrow on the very centre of your screen. So that literally shows you the exact centre of your screen. So that literally couldn't be a marker. So if you're not playing hardcore, then you really don't need to know this piece of information because you have something telling you exactly where the centre is. So that's your first piece of sort of non-advice debunked. Yes, being aware of the centre of your screen can help you sort of snap to your targets a little easier, but generally, this is something that should come naturally after playing for a while, and you're good enough that you don't really need to be told that. Secondly, pre-aiming. Right, now there are two types of pre-aiming. First of all, keeping your hip-fire crosshair in the most likely direction of enemies, anticipating enemies coming around the corner, for example, which we can all agree is pretty much a good habit to get into as long as you sort of remember to always sort of check your corners. And secondly, and more commonly, it means aiming down sight before or during moving out of cover. Pre-aiming down sight. Now, the first one, keeping your crosshair in the most likely direction of enemies, it's my belief that anticipation of an enemy coming around the corner, anticipation is like half the battle when it comes to being accurate. So that's a good thing. But the second one, aiming round corners, I've heard more than one YouTuber advise that you aim round corners. So basically pre-aiming while you're moving out of cover, which is the most Call of Duty advice I've ever heard. And I'm not hating on Call of Duty, I like Call of Duty. I started this channel making Call of Duty tip videos. But Call of Duty is a much sort of faster-paced, non-realistic, arcade-style game. And Battlefield has always been on the more realistic side. In reality, aiming around corners in Battlefield 1 is only really useful in two situations. One, when you know there is an enemy around the corner for a fact, because you've seen him on the minimap, or you've heard that there's an enemy around there, maybe you've got a good sound system. Then, in that case, it is obviously legitimate that you aim before moving out of cover, because you know there's an enemy there. And two, when you're about to sort of turn down a corridor or turn round the corner into a busy area, even sort of an open outside environment. Basically, where there's a high chance an enemy is going to be there, like for example, you're about to go sort of into an enemy-controlled flag area, then it's legitimate to aim before you sort of enter that area. If one of those two things isn't the case, then aiming down sight, in my opinion, is a bad idea. Because when you're aiming down sight, there's always a part of the weapon that's blocking your view. With iron sights and sort of buckhorn sight and the AA sight, the area that's blocked is usually the area under the sight, the actual main gun. So if you're aiming sort of upstairs or somewhere that's generally above ground level, you can't see what might be right in front of you. In one of the videos on aim that I watched, the demonstration this guy gave for sort of pre-aiming down sight specifically, he aimed sort of up the stairs in a house from the outside, from outside the doorway. And when he demonstrated it, looking up the stairs, you couldn't see the entire downstairs area because it was being blocked by the gun underneath the sight. Do you see what I mean? So in this guy's demonstration, if somebody was downstairs in plain view, he wouldn't have been able to see them. So that's your second piece of non-advice corrected. It's not really corrected, but you know what I'm saying. I advise that you don't aim down sight, especially close range when you're aiming down sight and your gun, it covers like the bottom third of the center of your screen. So I would say don't aim down sight. Thirdly, most videos I've seen, and I've watched a lot of videos on accuracy because I prefer to see what advice is already out there before chiming in with my shit advice. But most videos I've seen on improving your aim talk about tracking your targets as being this massive talking point. But once again, I sort of feel that that's kind of pointless. there's actually very little to say on the matter, because tracking your targets while you're aiming or shooting, it's sort of just personal skill, and it comes down to practice over time. But I'll quickly break it down anyway. Tracking your target comes down to 3 things, and the third is a massive thing which will open up into its own section in this video later, so let's get through it quickly. Number 1, predicting enemy movement. If an enemy is running, for example, left to right, then it's obvious you need to track him to the right. But you don't need to be told that, that's obvious. But it's often not that simple. I mean, most people don't just run in a straight line. And when they start getting shot, people's movement often becomes sort of erratic and hard to guess, for the obvious reason that they're trying to avoid getting shot. A little piece of advice: what makes it easier to sort of guess where they're about to run to is to see in your sights while you're shooting them. Try to see where the closest cover to the enemy is. I mean, if he's running towards like a wall or behind a building, obviously he's trying to get to cover, making it much easier for you to sort of know exactly where he's going to run, so you can track him with more accuracy. So yeah, predicting enemy movement is a big deal, but I mean, as long as you can see roughly where he's aiming to run to, it greatly helps you predict his movement. Super mustache twirl. Alright, look at that mustache. I look like a pirate. Number 2 for tracking your target. The further you are from your target in terms of distance, the more you have to aim in front of where they are running. This is called leading or leading your target. Now this is really only a sort of factor for sniping, because anything closer than that and the bullet travels pretty much fast enough that it doesn't make much of a difference. But as a general rule, if the enemy is running to one side, like aim at his front edge. So if he's running sort of like typically they run sideways. If they're running sideways, aim at the front side of them, if you see what I mean. And basically, if you're anything under medium range, it will pretty much hit the center of the enemy. This is because it takes the bullets a very small amount of time to actually travel to the enemy, by which point they've already moved a little bit. Number 3, using correct and consistent sensitivity values. Nothing ruins your ability to track and shoot enemies more than incorrect sensitivity values. And that leads me nicely into the main talking point of this video that's going to help your aim. Sensitivity! Now, this is possibly the single greatest sort of topic that is going to help your aim to accuracy. I'd say like a random number. 80% of all inaccurate shooting is probably down to incorrect sensitivity values. It's something that a lot of people sort of overlook when they really should be sort of playing about with it to sort of perfect their aim. For most people, more often than not, the sensitivity is too high. Now, the first thing that immediately needs to be said is that not only can you set separate sensitivity values for sort of infantry and ground vehicles and planes, but you can set separate values for individual zoom levels. And not everyone knows that. I'm talking about like you can have one separate sensitivity value for like 1.5 times zoom, 6 times zoom, 10 times zoom, for example. Every level of zoom can have its own value, which is awesome and unique as far as I'm aware of all modern games. Now, if you already know quite a lot about sensitivity values and you want to hear about uniform soldier aiming, then stick around for the end of this video where I'll sort of briefly discuss it. But if you have no idea what uniform soldier aiming is, just pretend I never said that. Right, now let's kick off with sensitivity. Before we get into individual zoom sensitivity, that's more advanced stuff. Before we get into that, I advise that you find your base sensitivity. By this, I mean tweak the main sensitivity value on the controls page using trial and error to make your hipfire movement comfortable and accurate. Now, the easiest way to test this is to do the 180 spin trick, or just sort of alternate your aim between 2 objects. I suppose that's the easiest way. Find 2 objects on your screen, and with hipfire, just move your aim back and forth between them. And you need to be tweaking your sensitivity values until that accuracy falls on those targets like 90% of the time. I mean, when alternating, if you keep overshooting, then it means your sensitivity is too high. And if you're pulling a little short, you need to raise it a bit. Now, I would say increase it or decrease it in small increments. Don't just jump a massive value. Do it in small increments until you find a comfortable place. And I mean comfortable literally. If you're using a mouse and keyboard, if you're on PC, then you don't want to overdo your wrist because it'll get annoying. But also you don't want like tiny minute movements because it'll be way too sensitive. And the same thing really can be said about using your thumb on a controller. You don't want to be overdoing it with the thumb or barely moving the thumb a little bit. You want to find a nice, happy, comfortable medium ground. Now, once your standard hipfire aim is comfortable and consistent, that's the main point, then we can move on to your aimed accuracy. I personally find it much more sort of helpful and proper to start with your standard hipfire accuracy first, and then all other accuracy and zoomed sensitivity values sort of branch off from that starting point. The reason I advise you use your hipfire accuracy as a sort of blanket starting point to figure out all your sensitivity values is because, in my opinion, it greatly helps with snapping to your target. Snapping literally means snapping your aim instantly to a target. If you have what I'll call a correct sensitivity, for you personally, your snapping to target should be landing over the target accurately, without the need to correct your aim to get there. Do you see the difference? Now, snapping is a general skill you learn over years of playing first-person shooter games. All the best players have excellent snap reflexes. It's one of the things that makes a great player. Reactions, baby! Now, as a general rule of thumb, I recommend that the higher the zoom level, the lower your sensitivity. I can only give you advice based on what's helped me. Now, if you've done that sort of hip-fire test I just mentioned before, and you've got sort of a consistent, accurate hip-fire movement, if you consider that base hip-fire sensitivity to be 100%, then ideally you want to be slowly working your way down the sensitivities until you get to 10 times zoom, which is the highest. Don't get me wrong, with every value at 100% you can learn to be accurate just as well as any other sensitivity. But it's easier to be more accurate if you actually take the time to mess around with all these values. Now, I know it can look a little daunting at first looking at all these values and having to change them all, but it can be very rewarding. Take that from me personally. Right off the bat, I'm telling you to do this shit. Keep your 1 zoom sensitivity 100%. That way, whether you're aiming down sight or just hip fire, when things are 1 zoom, i.e. normal, you want the sensitivity to be the same. You don't want a different sensitivity value aiming down sight at 1 zoom, because it'll throw things into confusing mess. Then I personally recommend you don't go below 50% for any zoom level, or it will start to feel too different from your hip fire movement. Do you know what I mean? You don't want it to be too different. But once again, I mean, it does come down to personal preference. Now, as some of you may have noticed from my gameplay, I have a very high sensitivity mouse. I use a 12,000 DPI mouse, which I know that won't mean anything to people who play on console, but it's very sensitive, which is why my main sensitivity on the general controls page is only, I think it's 20% for vehicles and infantry. Now, talking about PC and mice, if you are on PC as well, I recommend you turn on raw mouse input. Don't turn that shit off. Keep that shit on. This will remove any nonsense mouse acceleration from sort of your operating system or any other sort of program. But it won't if your mouse software has acceleration enabled. In my opinion, mouse acceleration is for sort of single-player games and pussies and regrettably console players. I'm sorry, but I hate mouse acceleration. Turning it off onto raw mouse input, yes, it makes the movement when you're barely moving, it makes it a bit jerkier. But in my opinion, it also makes it sort of easier to anticipate the movement in different directions. It just turn mouse acceleration off and turn raw mouse input on. Now, if you do what I suggested and you actually alter individual zoom level sensitivities, then you want to change your soldier zoom sensitivity to 100% on the general controls page, not the... See, all the individual zoom level sensitivities, they're on the advanced page and advanced tab at the top. I'm talking about the general page now. Soldier zoom sensitivity, turn it to 100%. Because if you have like 10 times zoom set to 50% speed and you set your general soldier zoom aiming to 50%, it'll take 50% speed and then it'll take 50% of that 50%. Set soldier zoom sensitivity to 100%, otherwise it's just confusing. That being said, if you can't be bothered to set individual values for every single zoom sensitivity, then just, you might want to keep all those 100% and switch the general setting to like 75% or something. That's only if you really can't be bothered with all the individual settings. And that'll just give you a blanket, slower aim speed across all zoom levels, as long as you're zoomed in. But I advise you take the time to actually set individual zoom levels. That's where the awesome accuracy is going to come from. Right, I will quickly add on, one problem with setting individual sensitivities for different zoom levels is field of view values. This isn't much of an issue if you always use one constant standard FOV setting, but if you get like all your sensitivities perfect and then change your FOV value, it will completely screw around with how your aiming feels, because if you have like a wider FOV, then your sensitivity doesn't seem as much. One solution to this, and actually a solution if you can't be arsed changing any settings at all, is to enable uniform soldier aiming, which is right at the bottom of the advanced page. Now, this setting is pretty damn complex, and even I don't totally understand how it works. But what I do know is it bases your sensitivity on screen space distance rather than zoom level or field of view. In simple terms, turning this setting on, and I've written this down because I've never remember this shit. In simple terms, turning this setting on apparently gives you like a natural sensitivity across the board, regardless of zoom level, FOV, and a bunch of other factors, making it feel literally uniform in all sensitivities across all zoom levels. Because of this, it apparently helps with muscle memory, because it makes your mouse movement and movement speeds, pretty much the same in every situation, whether using iron sights or a 10 times zoom scope or hip fire. And one can see the attraction to such a setting, but my opinion is, while that is the simpler option by far, I mean, it's just like one tick and then it's on and then you're done. While it's simpler, in my opinion, it doesn't make muscle memory any more accurate than getting used to your own specific settings. I mean, you can get used to anything if you play it enough, and with specifically tuned sensitivities for each level of zoom. Particularly if you go lower for the sort of higher zoom scopes. I mean, it's my personal belief that you don't want the same feeling with a 10 times scope as you do with iron sights. You don't want it to feel the same speed, you want it to feel slower, because it feels more accurate. Yes, it will be harder to get used to than uniform soldier aiming, but once you are used to it, your game will be hella accurate. Right, moving on. Recoil direction. Now, I've already done a whole video on this where I covered absolutely everything about it. You can find a link for that video in the description. But I'll give you a very, very fast summary now. A lot of people, myself included, pull naturally to one side when you drag your aim down to counter recoil. As with my main video on this, I advise, if you haven't done it before, to do a little test right now. Take your mouse or your controller and drag your aim downwards. Don't think about it too much. Don't try to center it on purpose. Just drag it down naturally without even thinking about it. And watch your cursor or aim if you're testing this in-game. You might be surprised to find that you actually pull slightly to one side. I personally pull slightly to the right on my mouse. So I equip recoil direction left on all of my weapons. And it works wonders! If you find that you consistently slightly drag to one side, equip the opposite direction recoil. So if you drag left, equip right direction recoil on your automatic weapons. This setting simply makes the recoil climb in one direction slowly. And the point is to counter people's natural pull, like I've suggested. It's an excellent and underrated setting, and once you get used to it, I mean, Jesus, it can make your kills feel much more accurate, seriously. Anyway, because I've made a whole video on recoil direction, I'm not going to go on about that anymore. Let's move on. I'm going to finish this video off discussing the basics of weapon control. Knowing your weapon and the way it handles can give you a serious boost to your overall accuracy. Maybe I should have put this at the beginning of the video, but whatever, who cares about the order of things? First piece of advice. Learn the true difference between weapon variants. I've covered weapon variants in their own separate video. Again, link in the description. But the variants differ a huge amount. To be as accurate as possible in general, you need to maximize the strengths of the type of weapon you're using or you're choosing to use. Let's burst through these really fast. If you're using, I mean, some are obvious. If you're using a trench weapon, they are most accurate when hip firing. Storm weapons are best for firing fully automatic at close and medium ranges because of their reduced recoil during sustained fire. Factory weapons is where a lot of people slip up. Factory weapons are most accurate when you control your firing, whether that's by burst firing or just taking your time between shots to be more accurate. Because factory weapons recoil and spread recovers much faster after shooting, not during. So for factory weapons to be effective, you need to sort of pause between shots. Now, optical weapons are more accurate over distance and have a nice glass lens sight so you can see around the center crosshair with more clarity. Far clearer than any type of iron sight. Now that leads me sort of onto my next point. Know the limits of each type of sight. As I alluded to earlier, each type of sight or scope has its own sort of drawbacks when it comes to aiming at things. Iron sights, and I include buckhorn and AA sights to be iron sights as well. Their main weakness is you generally can't see what's under the sight because it's being blocked by the gun itself. So all the varieties of iron sights are worse for when you're looking up at things because it's blocking what's underneath the gun. So you can't see a thing. If you're aiming up, you can't see a damn thing underneath the weapon. So that sort of leads me on to my next point. When it comes to iron sights and all variants of it, buckhorn and AA, I've developed a habit. The habit I formed when using iron sights is to aim down slightly when I'm surveying a general area, simply because it prevents the weapon from blocking up the bottom part of your view. But obviously, as soon as you see an enemy and start to track him, obviously move your aim immediately back up again. I mean, you could just keep the weapon sort of hip fire for surveying an area, but then you don't get the benefit of zooming down sight. That's pretty much it. I'm sure this video is going to be like 40 minutes long because I'm shit and I take too long to explain things. Knowing me, I've probably forgotten something severely important. Like, I've probably forgotten the most important thing. I'm shit when it comes to this advice stuff. If I have forgotten something very important or I've got something blatantly just wrong, comment down below and give me some of your own tips for being more accurate. I mean, it's not all about me, you know. What is wrong with me today? I'm being really weird today. Like this video if you liked it. Like this video if you didn't like it. Enjoy me in my next video. No idea what my next video will be. Might be another superclass. We shall see. And we shall only see when you open your eyes to see.